I'm Melina Tsapos, and this is In-Depth Conversations. Welcome to In-Depth Conversations. One of our time's technological revolutions is AI, and as much as it's a useful tool that we're all very excited about and think can provide to make our lives better in some way, there are also some worries, and especially some worries raised by philosophers that can be very important that we have to consider. There's, for example, the spread of disinformation that we hear a lot about and how AI can contribute to that. But there's also a phenomena called Slopaganda. And if you haven't heard that, don't worry, because it's not yet in the dictionary. But the person who coined the term is actually here to have a conversation with us today and explain this phenomena a bit better to us. This is none other than Mark Alfano, professor at Macquarie University in Australia. In his research, Mark uses tools and methods from philosophy, psychology, and even computer science to explore questions like how people become and remain virtuous. And in light of that, one of the guiding themes of his work is that I like this quote from his website that says, normative philosophy without psychological content is empty, but scientific investigation without philosophical insight is blind. So with that, very welcome to In-Depth Conversation, Mark.
Thank you so much, Melina. I should say that I owe that sort of to Kant. It's a rephrasing of something that he said about intuition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, there you go. But it's very, I like the quote because this is one area where maybe it's not so intuitive precisely how philosophy can contribute in AI and like what problems we could, maybe it is intuitive actually. But I want you to explain that, like what made you think about what the worries are around AI and how we use the generative AI tools?
Yeah, so I mean, philosophy has been part of research in artificial intelligence ever since there's been research in artificial intelligence. You can go all the way back to Leibniz, who developed this idea that maybe we can associate with each with each concept, a number, and then we can decompose more complex numbers using factorization to figure out what they mean. So for instance, if bachelor is 15, maybe that's because man and unmarried are 3 and 5. And if you multiply 3 and 5, you get 15. He really thought that you could sort of solve everything mathematically this way. Never worked it out. But philosophers and their sort of cousins in related disciplines have been working on AI for over a century. What's new now, I guess, is this generative AI, which has been around for a while, but really hit the scene with ChatGPT and GPT-3 a few years ago. And there's worries about it when it comes to things like students plagiarizing essays or using it to generate essays. So in the education domain, I've written about it in the context of mental health and therapy. So like one use of these chatbots is you can fine-tune one to imitate your dead grandmother and talk to her after she's gone and use that as a kind of therapy. But it's unclear whether this is actually going to help people or might actually prolong their grief. The Slopaganda thing is yet another issue. So this idea of slop is related to spam. So spam is unwanted emails. Slop is unwanted AI-generated content.
Right.
And if you combine slop with propaganda, which is aimed at manipulating the decision-making of populations, then you get something that I call slopaganda.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's good that you came to that term, because it sounds very cool. I think it's very catchy, and I think it can be very useful to identify this phenomena that you're after. But if we'll just dig a bit into it, because it's obviously propaganda is a part of it. And how did you define propaganda again?
So I think this is roughly a consensus view in the literature, or at least an accepted view, that propaganda doesn't necessarily have to be true or false, but it's rather utterances that are propagated into a population in order to manipulate the decision making of the people in that population.
Right. And so that means that can also be something positive and good. Like you could have propaganda about the population brushing their teeth, or is that?
Yeah, that would be.
Or it has to be political, or
it doesn't have to be political. It has to do with decision making. So unless you think all decision making is political, then you might think, oh well, public health messaging would count as propaganda.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church established during the Protestant Reformation established an office in charge of propaganda where they were trying to spread what they considered to be the correct view of Christianity.
Right. Okay. So that's also propaganda under the definition that
according to the people who did it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes,
and according to the definition I'm using.
Yes. Okay. All right. Yeah, because that's interesting. And then you said spam, like. You said that's unwanted email. Yeah, that's spam. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And so how do you put
this? Slop is unwanted AI generated content. Uh-huh. So in the same way that when we get spam in our inboxes, we're like, oh no, go away. We don't want this. The idea is that with Slop, you're maybe browsing your news feed or you're browsing a website and you see an image and you're like, wait, is this real? Is this not? The people have 6 fingers. This is kind of weird. I don't want to look at this. Like, why am I looking at this? And it could be an image. It could be text. It could be anything that generative AI can produce.
Okay. So it sounds like there is something that we should be worried about there if it's like propaganda that's unwanted in a way. Is that what you're after there with Slopaganda?
Yeah, that's the idea.
That's the idea?
Yeah.
And how is this something that's unique about what AI is contributing to this environment?
Yeah, so if you,
have we had it before, or
if you go back like 500 years, there was propaganda that was produced with a very different technology, like the printing press and woodcuts, and that is quite time-consuming, right? If I'm going to make a woodcut, making fun of the Pope, because I'm a Protestant, that might take me a week, and I can produce 100 copies. Or if you fast forward, look at the printing press. Okay, now we can go at a higher scale, but it's still pretty slow because I have to, if I'm Gutenberg, this takes a while. There are only so many Gutenberg Bibles for a reason, right? And then you fast forward a bit more, you get to things like radio and television. So, during World War II, Goebbels in particular was in charge of propaganda for the Nazi regime, and he installed the People's Radio in every household. And that meant that the Nazis could broadcast their propaganda into every house essentially at the speed of light. So that's a lot faster and a much larger scale. And now we have this Slopaganda possibility, or actuality, unfortunately, where you can not only produce it at scale and distribute it at scale, but also individualize it to someone's digital footprint. So if you know that someone has certain kinds of personality traits or demographic traits or preferences, you can feed them Slopaganda that's sort of tailored to them, which Goebbels would have loved to do, but he had to send the same radio message to everybody.
So you can actually tailor it now, which is another added level of danger or worry.
Yeah, so this micro-targeting kind of thing. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's getting better and better. And there's some research that suggests that AI-generated disinformation is more persuasive than human-generated disinformation, even when the human-generated disinformation is produced by people who research disinformation.
Wow. Okay. So how is that? Because does that mean then that people trust AI more somehow, or is it just being exposed more is enough? Because I imagine that people are more persuasive than something you just see on the internet, or is that not true?
The experiment I have in mind is comparing text produced by a human with text produced by
of course.
A chatbot. So it's comparing apples to apples in that sense. But it seemed, it's hard to know exactly what the mechanism is. I think more research is needed, but it seems that one heuristic that we use when evaluating whether a message is trustworthy is how confident and fluent the message is, even if it's false.
Okay.
And current generation chatbots and LLMs are very good at coming across as fluent and confident. And they're also drawing on a vast amount of training data, so they kind of seem plausible.
Yeah. Who do you imagine would use this as propaganda? Like, who are the actors that would?
That's a really good question. So I've been looking for sort of examples of it. I've seen pro-European Union Slopaganda that's like both anti-Russian and anti-Chinese and anti-American. I've seen sort of right-wing quasi-fascist propaganda, Slopaganda, that's anti-Europe. I've seen, actually you mentioned the other day, Chinese Slopaganda, sort of making fun of Trump's tariffs. So it seems like anyone with access to an LLM and a political agenda can produce this stuff.
Can produce it, yeah.
Relatively cheaply, too.
Yeah. So how do we, if I can just imagine what critics would say, how would we measure what's unwanted in this? How do we define the unwanted?
Yeah, unwanted by whom?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because the people who are propagating it wanted.
They wanted,
yeah.
Presumably, they think it's useful.
So the way that spam is defined is it's unwanted by the person who controls the email address. I guess in this case it would be unwanted by the citizen if they were fully informed of what they were looking at. So if the same image, for instance, that's produced by a generative AI, if it's used purely for entertainment and the person knows that it's AI generated and they're just having a laugh, that's one thing. But if they think it's a real image, or if it motivates them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, and if they realize that that was coming from an AI rather than from a human, then I would count that as unwanted.
Unwanted. Okay. Interesting. And then how do we navigate this in a way that, because let's say positive propaganda, though in Sweden we do quite a lot of that actually. We have, for example, we want to encourage children to read. So there's like literally a propaganda to get them to read more campaign. And
can they read it already?
I mean, good question. I think what they want to do. So
they're already literate. They're
literate, but to read more books. Actually, that's like
Yeah.
So not just listen to audiobooks, for example. They want them to actually read more books.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's like a big push for that now. Like the government has dedicated funds and stuff for it. And there's also another thing, like the Swedish alcohol is very regulated. So you have to go to a specific shop called Systembolaget. You can't buy it anywhere. And they also produce a lot of propaganda to discourage people from drinking in a wrong way, or excessively. So I'm just saying we're these things, but this, I mean, of course, maybe I'm not interested in reading, right? Like as an individual, even though it should be good for me to do it, like somebody thinks it's good for me to do it. I'm thinking about this tension between freedom of your own choices and the choices you make compared to what maybe is better for you, but maybe you don't want to make that change, and somebody else decides that this is good or bad for you. Can you see something that, because I imagine you would have to control the Slopaganda for a group of people. You can't just ask each individual,
that's interesting. So, I mean, when it comes to spam, I'm very glad that I have a spam filter for my email. But it's not 100% reliable. It has both false positives and false negatives. And one thing you can do is, you fish through your spam folder and you mark it as not spam, and that personalizes the filter for you. Likewise, if something gets through that you don't want to look at because it's a phishing scheme or something, you can mark it as spam, and that again is used to train the classifier. That's a very simple approach, but it's pretty effective. My spam filter is probably like 99% effective, maybe 99.9% effective. And you could have the same kind of thing with slop. So if you see a news story or an image or something, you could mark it as slop. And that would eventually train a classifier that could be used sort of generically and then also personalized for your particular preferences.
Okay, because that's a totally different way of thinking about it than I have been thinking about before. Because when I thought about like the way people talk about disinformation, for example, typically it's something that we think it's bad for the collective, like for the group. It's not like there's choice in what I think is good information for me, and then whatever I don't like is disinformation. So here it seems like you have more control, like you have more trust in the individual making these choices. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, if it's sufficiently problematic, maybe it shouldn't be solely down to the individual, but I think that in the same way that we trust people to decide what counts as spam for them, we could decide to let them decide what counts as slop for them. And maybe there are people who enjoy what I would call spam.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for them. And maybe there will be people who enjoy slop and Slopaganda, but probably most people, even I would wager the vast majority of people, don't like this stuff. They find it annoying at best and manipulative at worst. Mm-hmm. So allowing people to classify stuff in this way could take advantage of a system that we already have had in place for decades when it comes to email.
Yeah, sure. And I have AdBlock, which I love.
Yeah,
right?
Me too. I have 3 of them.
Good. I need more as well. But I imagine, so the danger here would be that, so if somebody doesn't like it or is annoyed by it, are they still susceptible to it? Or because the danger must be, I imagine, that people tend to believe the things or are converted or like somehow affected by the messaging.
Yeah, I mean, so the research on persuasion in psychology and cognitive science suggests that most attempts at persuasion are ineffective. Especially when people have already made up their mind, getting them to change their mind is extremely difficult. When someone has not yet formed an opinion or a preference, then they are, to some extent, susceptible to influence. So what would be worrisome to me would be Slopaganda that is targeted at issues and decisions where people haven't yet made up their minds and are susceptible in this way. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's lots of things to think about, so most of us haven't made up our minds about most things. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of room for that.
Yes, that's very interesting, because if we just segue a bit into what you've done a lot of research on, virtues, and how a person can make right moral decisions and be virtuous. Do you see that being a guiding, what can a person do to make right choices in this? What to avoid and what to...
Yeah, so we have consider. A decent amount of evidence, both from my research group and from others, that intellectual humility is really helpful in this regard. So, it sounds maybe a bit religious or old-fashioned to talk about humility, but when researchers in this area talk about intellectual humility, they mean owning your intellectual limitations, which means both recognizing them and responding appropriately to them. And of course, unless you're omniscient, you have intellectual limitations. Everyone does. There are things I don't know, there are skills I don't have, there are biases that I'm susceptible to, and to the extent that I'm intellectually humble, I recognize those things and try my best to rectify them, especially in high stakes circumstances and decision making. And we have evidence that people who score high on intellectual humility, as measured by either self-report or reports from their family members and friends, or even based on the language that they use, are better equipped to reject false messages that are conveyed to them, say about conspiracy theories, and also better equipped to accept true messages that are conveyed to them, including about conspiracies. So An intellectually humble person is more likely to say, yes, Osama bin Laden did 9/11, and also to reject the idea that it was an inside job by the Bush administration.
Okay, all right. But with being virtuous in that way, like owning your own shortcomings, I think I'm agreeing with you that it seems like you can protect yourself that way, like your knowledge. But what does it look like for the group? Because there will always be some narcissists or some people who really, really have lack intellectual humility, right, or epistemic humility.
Unfortunately, yes.
Right. So won't they dominate then on people who are just constantly being humble? What does that do in group levels? Is it?
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So there's both theoretical and empirical work on this that suggests that only about 5% of, say, internet users are endorsing crazy conspiracy theories, but they're extremely vocal. They're just always posting. So you get something like the 80-20 rule, but in this case, it's more like the 95-5 rule, where like most of the content, the vast majority of content about this kind of thing is produced by a very small number of very vocal people who are often extremely dogmatic. Mm-hmm. This is a problem we've had ever since we've had the internet. The problem I'm worried about with the Slopaganda stuff is, if I have to type every message myself because I'm in a Russian troll farm or something, that takes me time, right? That's work. It's 9 to 5. If I can give a prompt to an API and produce 10,000 of those messages in 7 seconds, right? The scale is very different. So in the same way that like the woodcuts are different from the radio, this stuff is different from troll farms, and I think we're not really prepared for it. And there's no, as far as I know, there's no adequate regulation or law about it. And a lot of people are kind of overconfident that they can see it when it's happening, but they're not actually able to reliably detect this stuff. Yeah. One solution, technological solution that might help a bit would be watermarking. So we know that OpenAI has tested and confirmed that they're able to watermark text that their model produces. They just haven't allowed regulators and governments to understand how this watermarking works. But it's things like, for text at least, if you use ChatGPT, it will produce text that has like too many J's or too many K's in it. It just like that doesn't match how ordinary people talk. Yeah. And then you can go back and find that if you want to. Well, Sam Altman can. I can't. Yeah. But this kind of watermarking could be used more transparently, so that if you're looking at an image, there could be some kind of insignia on it that says like, oh, this is AI produced. Right. Or text. You could know that, oh, this is AI. This is not from a human, so it's not sincere. Okay. So do you see that's the right path to go, or the right way to go? We would want to have that regulated somehow through government incentives, or? I think it's at least worth trying, yeah. Okay. I mean, it's the Wild West right now, and if it only is done from some companies and others don't do it, then you still can't trust what you see online. But maybe if the biggest players in this sector are required to watermark in a transparent way, that could help. Okay. Do you see any, I think personally it's kind of an exciting area to be working in, because like you said, it's a Wild West at the moment. So we need a lot of, this is actually an area where we need a lot of bright minds that can think clearly about this, and we need to discuss it as a society, because it's just growing right in front of us, like it's constantly improving and getting better and better. Do you see any positive things with, like what do you think is the most positive thing with AI? Interesting. With generative AI, I think the most positive is pretty clearly coding.
Okay.
So if you're trying to code in Python or R or just any language really, the training data includes an immense amount of stuff from Stack Overflow, where coders give each other advice about how to accomplish various tasks in different platforms. And the nice thing about coding is that if you get it right, you see immediately that you got it right, because it compiles and it produces what you want. And if you get it wrong, it fails catastrophically. So you get really fast and reliable feedback that this was, in fact, this generated code does what it's supposed to do. With things like prose and images, you don't get that kind of fast, reliable feedback. And so for these kinds of things, I think that generative AI is more dodgy. Not that there's no uses, but that it's a little bit trickier. In a recent paper with Olya Kudina and Brian Bolson-Stanton, I argued that the fact that generative AI makes mistakes, it hallucinates, as people say, probably better to say that it confabulates, can be useful. So with my students, I sometimes tell them, okay, if you write an essay and you're worried about, how the quality of your argument, and you're maybe a little bit anxious about asking for my advice because you don't want your professor to tell you that you made a mistake, it feels bad, you can ask ChatGPT to give you counter-arguments and counter-examples. And some of them will be stupid and wrong, but some of them might actually be interesting, and then you can revise your essay in light of that. So I think that's actually kind of fun.
That's very helpful.
Useful thing.
Yeah. You know what I've done?
What have you done?
I've asked it to pretend to be a reviewer for a journal.
Oh yeah, okay.
It's actually really good.
Similar kind of thing.
Yeah, it gives me really good feedback. Like, oh, you're missing, talking about the limits of your model, for example. And I'm like, oh yeah, that should be an obvious thing that I should include. But yeah, I think it's, for those kind of things, it's really nice to have that feedback.
Yeah, because we're all susceptible to confirmation bias to some extent. So getting that kind of criticism from a source that is just a computer is actually quite helpful, because if it's coming from someone you respect and trust, and then you feel like you're an idiot, that's unpleasant. But if it's coming just from a piece of software, you can be like, oh yeah, that's a good idea.
True. That's interesting how that works. Like maybe you put your ego aside a bit easier. Yeah, true. Okay, so what's next step now in your research on this? Do you have any future plans on Slopaganda research?
I'd really like to figure out how to compare different models and see which ones are more susceptible to producing this. And that would involve collaboration with people in computer science and also in psychology, cognitive science. I'd also like to develop interventions that help people to recognize this stuff and deal with it appropriately. There are very few interventions that actually improve intellectual humility, but one promising one that Igor Grossman, who's a psychologist in Canada, has developed involves sort of taking a kind of psychological distance from yourself and thinking of yourself in the third person. And that seems to enable people to recognize the mistakes that they made more easily. And those could be mistakes in reading and looking at images that involve Slopaganda.
Very nice way of like bringing the different types of sciences, psychology and computer science, into this research. As a philosopher too, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me and telling me about Slopaganda. I'm sure it's going to catch on so much. It's a good term.
Word of the year.
Yeah.
Thank you, Melina. I
Thank
really
you so
enjoyed
much,
it.
Mark.